Welcome to Talking Fraud, a podcast series by MIAA, providing you with informal insights on all things fraud. This podcast was recorded in November 2022, and all information within the podcast was correct at the time of recording. Episode 1, NHS Fraud. What's the problem? Hello and welcome to MIAA's Anti-Fraud Service's first podcast. Hopefully this will be the first of a series of podcasts talking about fraud in the NHS in particular, but we may widen it out to other topics in future episodes. A little bit about background from ourselves. We're the senior members of MIAA's Anti-Fraud Service. Introductions. We've got a head of service here, Daryl Davies. Do you want to say a little bit about your own background?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Just like to say from the outset how pleased I am that we're actually here now in the studio recording this first podcast. It's been quite a while since we've had this in the kind of planning stages, and it's great to put it into practice. And I'm really excited about being here with you and with Claire as well to get this underway. As you mentioned, I'm head of MIAA's Anti-Fraud Service. I've been in the post now for probably 7 or 8 years, and our role very much is around working with clients in the NHS and the wider public sector to both create an anti-fraud culture and also to investigate allegations of fraud and see those through to the conclusion, whether it be criminal outcome or whatever. And I'm sure we'll talk about that in more detail. But yeah, very excited to be here and looking forward to today's podcast. Yeah,
it should be fun. Claire Smallman.
Yes, so my name's Claire Smallman. I am a Senior Anti-Fraud Manager with MIAA. I've worked for the organisation for 14 years. Some previous experience, I was a benefit fraud investigator, so for 17 years back for the Department for Work and Pensions, so very much of an investigation background, but also excited to be here today for this podcast.
Thanks, Claire. So a little bit about myself. My name's Paul Bell. I'm also a Senior Anti-Fraud Manager with MIAA. My background, probably been involved in fraud, financial crime investigations for getting on for 25 years in the public sector, the private sector, conducted investigations in the UK and overseas. So I think between the three of us, we've got quite a bit of experience, particularly dealing with NHS Counter Fraud, but also fraud in the wider sense as well in other areas of the public sector and beyond. So today's first episode of this podcast, we've called NHS Fraud, So What's the Problem? And I think what we're going to do by way of a background introduction, given this is our first podcast, we're just going to talk briefly about how NHS Counter Fraud came about, the origins of it, the background to it before NHS Counter Fraud was put in place as an entity, and then we're going to bring it up to date in terms of what does it look like in 2022. So any sort of observations? You've been around in the NHS for quite a while, Daryl, so before NHS Counter Fraud came into place in sort of 98, 99. What's your experience of how fraud was dealt with before then?
Well, I suppose linking into that, and not, I should say at the outset, not my personal experience, but fraud isn't a new crime. And you can actually, I was looking this up on Google, I don't know off the top of my head, but essentially the first kind of recognised fraud was committed in the year 300 BC, which, goes back quite a considerable bit of time. And that related to an insurance fraud, believe it or not, and a fraud that, insurance fraud, which we still see today. So essentially a merchant in ancient Greek was insuring his boat to carry corn to another port. And he hit upon the idea of the fact he was going to pretend that the boat had been sunk in a storm and was therefore this wasn't going to happen, but he was going to then take the corn to market, sell the corn, and then also claim off the insurance that the boat had been sunk and that all the produce had been lost. So that's one of the earliest examples of fraud, and not something, probably, as I say, that I was around for. But yeah, it shows that fraud is a long-standing criminal crime. And in the public sector, very much in previous years, fraud is always kind of left to internal auditors or those people who had perhaps an interest in pursuing and an interest in kind of fraud and raising the awareness and the culture within organisations to pick that up. And the people weren't necessarily trained investigators. So it was always very an ad hoc approach. And I think, as we've seen with ourselves, the job that we do over recent years, the frauds have become far more sophisticated and the attempts have increased quite considerably. And I think there was probably a perception of back in the 90s that, something needed to be done more formally to investigate and pursue fraud, because especially in the public sector, the money that's lost through fraud is the money that's taken away from where it should be going, whether it's providing services through local authorities, whether it's treating patients through the NHS. So it became much more of a priority. And I think there was some work, wasn't there, done, Paul, a study back in the 90s looking at the potential cost of fraud to the public sector?
Yeah, I think there was a culture, certainly probably starting around 1992, looking at accountability of public funds, just in terms of the public purse and making sure it could be fully accountable and justifiable. And that kind of built up, I think, through the early to mid to late 90s and culminated in, I think it was around about 1998 when the National Audit Office was tasked with actually looking at the extent of fraud and irregularity in obviously one of the biggest public sector areas of the UK, the NHS, and identified potential losses of around about 2 billion per annum. So I think that was sort of the driving force and the motivation as to sort of what kicked things off and formalising the anti-fraud structure in the public sector. And I think prior to that, it was very much, as you say, sort of piecemeal, ad hoc. There was no national coordinated strategy. It was very much left to individual auditors. I do recall myself, I was working in the public sector for a period of the 1990s, not in health, but in a different area of the public sector. And, you know, we had a few fraud referrals coming through to us, and it was literally scrabbling around in terms of, well, okay, what do we do next? Do we go straight to the police? Do we look at it ourselves? What was your experience in a different sector as well, Claire?
I think, you know, coming from the Department for Work and Pensions and the frauds, I think they did have, you know, process procedures in place, and it had been running for a long time as sort of a fraud function. So coming into the NHS for me back in 2008 was a bit of an eye-opener around that the policy, the procedures that were in place within the Department for Work and Pensions weren't necessarily in place. You didn't have the same powers when you came into the NHS. And fundamentally, even now, you know, 12, 14 years on, it's a case of the types of frauds that we get across the table. You know, you may never have seen one before within the NHS. We are the biggest employer in the UK, so we are going to have a whole host of various types of fraud cases. And I think that for me, coming from a benefit fraud background where benefit fraud, you know, is quite similar, just depends on what benefits people are receiving. But within the NHS, it was quite eye-opening, the amount of fraud and the amounts of different types of frauds that are within the NHS that need investigating. And certainly, you know, we've made some good grounds, even from since when I've started around the NHS fraud investigation and detection.
So bringing it back to this National Audit Office review, I think it was about 1998. That, I think, really was the impetus to sort of pull things together and come up with some kind of coordinated strategy. So on the back of that, Department of Health decided it was going to create a dedicated NHS Counter Fraud structure. And at the time, they put certain mechanisms in place, and they brought in a gentleman called Jim G, who'd been dealing with counter fraud in, I think it was Lambeth Council in the Greater London area, and he'd had quite a degree of success. But he was essentially the first head of the NHS counter fraud function, which I think back in the time was called the NHS Counter Fraud and Security Management function.
Yeah.
And that was the original. It's gone through a few name changes, which we'll cover during the podcast. But that was the original name, and you'll notice from that name as well, there was a security management element to it, which no longer exists today, but we'll cover that. So that was the original sort of foundations in around about 1999, 98, 2000. I did my training back in 2002, so I think I was one of the first ones. I think Roger, who previously worked with us and has just recently retired, had one of the lowest number counter fraud identity cards.
Yeah.
I think Roger literally did go back to 300 BC.
Yes, he probably did. Yeah, he was probably involved in that original
He's
investigation.
probably the corn thief.
So I think between the three of us, we were probably sort of quite early on in the process of going through the accredited training. And we'll talk a bit more in either this episode or the next episode around, you know, what's involved in being a counter fraud specialist in the NHS and the training that you go through and things like that. But Jim was essentially tasked with putting together the structure, putting together a central team, and then obviously cascading that down into all the NHS organisations in England and Wales, having a dedicated local counter fraud specialist, which is, you know, where we are today. As I mentioned, it's gone through a number of different name changes. 2017, it became NHS Protect. Up to 2017, it was NHS Protect. And now it's the NHS Counter Fraud Authority. So there's at least 3 name changes in the 20-year period. But fundamentally, it does today what it was set out to do. Well, its original remit was back in 99 and 2000.
And I think it's really good that we have that strategy in place because, under those older arrangements, very much a lot of the kind of internal fraud, not necessarily benefit fraud perhaps, but the allegations that were made against maybe individual employees or people associated with it, with the council or NHS, never tended to go through a formal investigation process or didn't end up in court. And that could be quite frustrating, really, for those people involved in undertaking those investigations. And again, as we'll probably keep harking back to all the way through these podcasts, is the fact that this is public money that we're talking about here, and we need to get that money back into the system as much as possible. And especially, in the current climate, we can't afford to be losing lots of money through waste and criminality, especially.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I think. An observation from myself, having worked in the private sector and the public sector, is the focus is very different. There was a real structure in NHS Counter Fraud when it was set up, focusing on prevention as well as recovery and investigation of fraud. So there was the preventative side of it as well as the reactive investigative side of things. And I think, back in 20 years ago, there was probably only really the NHS and the Department of Work and Pensions that really had focused, dedicated counter fraud functions in the public sector. I think, would that be your experience? Possibly Revenue and Customs?
I was going to say, HMRC,
Yeah.
And local authorities as well. So there were a number, and obviously, the work that we've done there, the work we do now sort of covers third-party organisations as well. So,
And I think sort of bringing things up to date as well, we've just seen the creation of the Public Sector Fraud Authority, which its remit is to coordinate counter-fraud activity on a consistent basis across all public bodies, government departments and public agencies. So, that's where it's moved to. And I suppose you could comment on the fact that it's taken 20 years for that single coordinated cross-government approach. And it's only just been launched in August of 2022. And that one of its key remits is to sort of pull together and coordinate the fight against public sector fraud.
Absolutely, and I can see, there's been times, hasn't there, when we've done investigations and we have fallen foul of third-party organisations not wanting to get on board and share that. That's had a negative effect on what we do as well. So, all for promoting that, and hopefully we'll make that work a lot easier for us.
I think it's about time as well, isn't it? Because if we're being honest, this should have been brought in many, many years ago. As we've already mentioned, fraud has been on the rise for decades now, and it's getting far more sophisticated. And even though we've had the NHS Counter Fraud strategy and people working at various organisations to try and combat fraud, the best way is to have a national strategy, a national agency that kind of addresses this area and makes sure that we're all operating in a coordinated manner. I mean, I remember years ago, frauds would be very simple to detect. There used to be a lot of these kind of letters that would come through from purporting to be from an individual from a foreign country, saying they'd come into an amount of money and wanted access to somebody's bank account in the UK to be able to transfer this cash. And they would offer an individual, an amount of money to facilitate this transaction. But essentially, as we know, it's just a big con to get access to somebody's bank account. But you could very quickly tell from those letters that they weren't bona fide just by looking at the grammar, the spelling, etc. But nowadays, the extent to which fraudsters are going to try and deceive people, setting up fake website that looks like PayPal or Amazon or whatever it may be, just shows how sophisticated these groups are.
Absolutely.
And I suppose, if you think about it in a way, they may put all this effort in, but if you can target an organisation and maybe secure one invoice that may be worth 500,000 or £1 million, if we're talking about big corporations like the NHS, then from their perspective, it's been worth putting that effort in. So we do need a national strategy and to be able to, and a national body to be able to kind of really focus on some of these high concept, crimes that we're seeing at the moment.
It's interesting. Yesterday I had a phone call from an organisation, and it was around one of their international nurses that had been approached via Instagram, and from one thing to another has made her use her bank details for Bitcoin and had lost £6,000. And that was just yesterday. So as you were saying, the ways that people commit the frauds now are going via social media channels, things that people, are on all the time looking at, and that individual now's £6,000 short in a bank account, and provided that information to the fraudsters, obviously unknowing of what was going to happen. But so he's going to probably struggle, I would assume, to try and recover that money back.
And I think wherever, we hear about various types of frauds that are being committed, and we're sending out alerts and trying to raise awareness that the fraudsters are always trying to be one step ahead of that, aren't they? And looking at some new different way of utilising social media technology to try and, you know, elicit funds extract funds rather from individuals.
Absolutely.
So it's becoming harder and harder, isn't it? And I think people sometimes are more relaxed as well when they're online, they're at home. You know, they'll get something through on an email or an Instagram or a Facebook notification, and they're more likely to maybe click on something or accept something that perhaps if they were approached directly through face-to-face or verbal contact, perhaps they wouldn't be so willing to give over certain bits of information that can be used against them.
Absolutely. And I think also with the current climate that we're in, where people, you know, are struggling for money, then anything that comes in that might be able to, you know, increase their income, that's going to, you know, be something they might want to consider, but obviously not really looking into the implications of it. Is it genuine, or am I actually going to end up losing money through this? So yeah, it's, you know, it's not good when you get those types of referrals, and obviously, you know, we forwarded them on to Action Fraud, an organisation that, you know, then takes on these referrals and decides who should investigate them. But yeah, and I think this individual, because they were an international nurse as well, you know, didn't quite understand the sort of rules, the regulations, and the sort of processes within this country, and was almost an easy target for somebody, which is, you know, very sad. She's individuals working all the hours to get the money in to pay the bills, and then fraudsters just in the blink of an eye take £6,000 from the bank account.
I think it's, you know, really important what you said there about kind of the social environment that we find ourselves in, and that can influence, you know, fraudsters and individuals' kind of responses to being targeted by fraud. I mean, already I've seen this week examples of texts that have been sent through to individuals related to the energy price cap.
Yeah.
So essentially the government's saying each household is going to get £400 off their bill over the next 6 months. And these texts are going out telling people, you're due this refund, please click on this link below. And people think, oh yeah, we do that money. So they'll click on it, provide their personal information, bank account details, and before they know it, you know, their bank accounts will be cleaned out. And it just shows again how the fraudsters are scanning things that are happening in wider society, you know, initiatives that are being brought in by the government, and thinking about ways in which they can, you know, use those to their own ends to get money out of people.
Yeah, absolutely. And similar, a member of my family had received a text from the Royal Mail, you know, you've got a parcel that needs to be delivered, but you need to pay a bit more. And quite often we will have parcels that are due to be delivered, and my member of the family, you know, clicked on it, provided all the bank details from their bank card, paid their 72 pence, I think it was, and then the next day gets a call from what she thought was a bank saying that somebody had tried to use her bank card in a shop, but actually it was the fraudster, and she was convinced, and you know, that it was the bank, and she was like, they had my card number, my address. And it was only from talking to her, and she did realise towards the end of the conversation and put the phone down, but it was all associated to that link she clicked on the day before. So the fraudsters did have the details off a card because she'd used it to pay the 72 pence. So, you know, and anyone could fall foul of that if you are expecting a parcel. And as you say, this is the way that these fraudsters then just take advantage of individuals and, you know, take money that's not theirs.
Absolutely. I've got a kind of personal experience of that recently. So we went to Amsterdam, we split up. So myself and this other guy went to the Ajax football stadium to go on a tour around that, and our partners' wives went to a museum, and there was a museum where you actually bought the tickets online before you could go in. You couldn't actually purchase it at the venue. So my wife went online to what she thought was the museum website, but it actually wasn't. The pop-up link came up, and she put her details into that to pay for the tickets. The tickets didn't come through. And about 10 minutes later, she got a phone call from Barclays fraud team. So, you know, she'd been scammed from that. So that was highly embarrassing, you know, and I did make that clear, you know, that she was letting me down as the wife of MIA's head of fraud. But it just goes to show, you know, how easily that can happen, you know, and you can just be off your guard slightly, and, you know, you can soon become a, you know, potential victim of fraud.
Absolutely.
So I think, listen to those sort of observations, your personal observations that you've just given. I think we'd probably all agree that the number of ways you can commit fraud is probably quite finite, but the mechanisms by which you commit those frauds has significantly changed in the last 20 years. You were talking, Darrell, about the letters. I've inherited a load of money, you know, I need access to your bank account in order to get it out of the country, et cetera, et cetera. what used to be a letter is now an email. I can remember first using the internet back in around about 1997. But in the last 20 years, all the mechanisms we now have to communicate, be it through texts, WhatsApp messages, emails, social media, all of those mechanisms are now being used to perpetrate frauds in the NHS and beyond. It's probably about 50% of what we look at is what we would call cyber-enabled fraud, and we'll talk about that, I think, in a bit more detail in a future episode as well.
And it's amazing how much information people actually put online now, whether it's using things like, Facebook and Twitter, but also, what you would think maybe a business related to like LinkedIn, where people will put all kinds of information about where they work, how long they've been there, what their job role is, what their main responsibilities are. And an example of where that was used in a fraud was actually in a local Merseyside trust, whereby the fraudsters were attempting to have the bank account details of a supplier changed to a fraudulent bank account. And to gain the confidence of the individual working for the NHS Trust, they went online and looked up details of this supplier and individuals who worked for this supplier, and found somebody who worked in the accounts payable department, so they're people who would process the invoices for the contractor, and actually use that information then to set up a false email account, false job titles, etc., all to get the confidence of somebody at the trust to then pay out that invoice. And that invoice that was eventually paid to this fraudulent bank account was just under £1 million. So illustrates the point I was making before about how you put all that effort in, but actually, if you can get one invoice for £900,000, then from a fraudster's perspective, it's been worth it. And once that money goes into that fake bank account, before you know it, it's transferred overseas. So the chances of ever recovering that money or making a prosecution for the people who are behind that are very, very slim.
Do you think anything's particularly changed in the last 20 years? Do you think we're pretty much doing what we were doing 20 years ago, other than accepting the sort of the use of media technology to commit frauds? Do you think the strategy that we're applying today is very much similar to how it was 20 years ago when it was set up?
I think it predominantly is. I think the broad principles of trying to instill an anti-fraud culture within an organisation, and by that I mean, raising awareness of what is fraud, how can you potentially be targeted by fraud, what you should do if you are the victim of fraud, and then looking at how we strengthen controls, processes, systems within an organisation to try and prevent or keep fraud to a minimum, has remained the same, and probably needs to remain the same. Probably the way in which we go about delivering those messages and doing that work has changed slightly. So again, we wouldn't have been doing a podcast, would we, 20 years ago, as a way of informing people. We wouldn't have been using maybe software to identify bogus transactions, for example. We'd be doing everything very manually. And I think, we have changed our approach, but the fundamentals of the strategy remain the same, and probably will largely remain the same going forward as well, in my opinion. What do you think, Claire?
Yeah, no, I think that's the case. And obviously the environment that we're in at the moment with all the recent pandemic has also made us have to sort of change the way in which we work. No face-to-face presentation. So we've had to look at how can we get the messages out to members of staff within the NHS around fraud during, a crisis. And not only that, it's getting the messages out, but making sure that people then are reading them, are reading the comms we send out. So I think, yes, we're always changing, but fundamentally, it's the same. It's just new ways of working, isn't it?
Yeah. I think, one of the reasons we're doing this podcast is, we acknowledge the fact that the fraudsters are quite sophisticated, probably more organised than they were 20 years ago. There's still opportunistic fraudsters, but there's a lot more organised criminal fraudulent activity, and they are using multiple mechanisms to commit the fraud. So, we need to keep up with that and use multiple mechanisms to get the anti-fraud message out and advice and guidance to all our clients and beyond the clients as well, really, I think. But coming back to your point and sort of trying to pull things together for, concluding this particular episode of the podcast, I think your point around, what we do today is pretty much fundamentally very similar to what, we were doing when Jim G set this up 21 years ago. And the strategy, which we'll talk about in the next episode in a bit more detail, works very well. It's a good strategy to apply, and we'll cover the key elements of that strategy, as I say, in the second episode. But I also think it's worth pointing out as well, other areas of the public sector are following suit. Public sector fraud authority has now been created, but a lot of what we do in the NHS is being replicated in the wider public sector as part of that ongoing approach. So yeah, I think fundamentally we're not changing what we're doing significantly. I think some of the information, some of the intelligence we have access to, some of the cases, some of the successes are probably changing.
Yes, we are doing things the same way, but we also need, whilst we keep the kind of same approach, we need to think about maybe delivering it slightly differently, don't we? And being more effective in the way in which we do that. And I think that's kind of what we're all kind of striving to do by doing things like the podcasts and
I think, in terms of like the fraud examples and the types of frauds, they've not necessarily changed in the time that I've been here. I think certain things are coming more to the forefront than that was. So you sort of, for example, your working while sick was always the sort of biggest fraud within the NHS. But now, the mandate fraud is one of the most significant ones. So I think certainly in my time working in the NHS, the types of fraud haven't changed. There's just lots of them, lots of different types of ways people can defraud the NHS, unfortunately. And, we've got some successful cases for MIAA, but also nationally, there's been some good examples of cases as well.
Okay, so that's been really quite informative. I think we'll go into a bit more detail in the second episode, and hopefully in future episodes we'll talk a bit more detail around particular types of fraud, some of the cases that we've worked on or have been in the public domain nationally over the last 20 years. So if you want to find out a bit more about our podcast, which is called Talking Fraud, you'll find them on Spotify, Apple, other main podcast sites as well. You can also find more information about how we perform counter-fraud activities and the work that we do on the MIAA website, and we've got a dedicated fraud section on there. And
this is the first of a number of episodes that we hope to cover. Yeah,
hopefully,
depending on viewing figures, listening figures,
depending on listening figures. Yeah.
So hopefully we'll be back.
Whether we win any awards as well.
Thank you for listening.
Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.
You can find MIAA's Talking Fraud through all the usual podcast platforms.